The dead payphone. The payphone on 2nd Avenue had been decommissioned in 1999 as part of a broader city infrastructure update that removed dozens of public payphones from downtown Harrisburg. Verizon, which managed the line, confirmed to a local reporter in 2003 that the service account had been formally closed and the line physically capped at the junction box, meaning the copper wire connecting the phone to the active network had been severed at the point where it joined the broader system. In every administrative and physical sense, the phone was dead. The man who answered the call was David Carey, a 44-year-old postal worker who was walking his dog late in the evening on March 14, 2002. He described the incident in a written statement provided to Harrisburg police the following morning. He said the phone began ringing as he was passing it. He noted it rang approximately 4 times, a normal cadence, not a single ring or an irregular burst. He picked it up out of curiosity, not expecting anything in particular. What he heard he described as like a voice underwater, the rhythm of speech, but not the words. He said it lasted approximately 8 seconds. Then the line went silent and stayed silent. He held the receiver for another few seconds, heard nothing, and hung up. Carey filed the report not because he was frightened or believed something paranormal had occurred. He said, in his own words, that it seemed like something that should be written down somewhere. Police contacted Verizon, who confirmed what Carey already suspected. A technician was sent to examine the junction box and verified the cap was intact. The physical disconnection was in place. Nothing had been tampered with or reconnected. The technician's informal explanation, relayed through the police report, was phantom current. This is a real and documented phenomenon in copper wire telecommunications infrastructure. When a line is capped but not fully removed, residual electrical charge can remain in the wire. Nearby active lines running through the same conduit generate electromagnetic fields, and those fields can induce small amounts of current in adjacent inactive wires. In old payphone hardware that has not been fully deactivated at the component level, meaning the bell mechanism is still physically connected, that induced current can be enough to trigger the ringer. This explains why the phone rang. It is a credible, well-understood mechanism. What it does not explain is what Carey heard when he picked up the handset. Phantom current and electromagnetic induction can activate a mechanical bell. They do not, in any standard technical description of the phenomenon, produce coherent audio output through a handset speaker. Electrical noise in a disconnected line can generate low-frequency hum or static in a receiver under certain conditions. What it does not typically produce is the patterned, rhythmic quality that Carey described, the rise and fall of what sounded to him like speech. One possibility is that Carey's perception filled in a pattern that was not there. The human auditory system is well documented in its tendency to find structure in ambiguous sound, particularly when a person is already in an unusual and attention-focusing situation. A man who has just answered a phone that shouldn't be ringing is primed to listen carefully, and careful listening in ambiguous audio conditions can produce the perception of speech where only noise exists. That explanation is plausible, but it is not confirmed. No acoustic analysis of the line was ever conducted. The technician's visit was brief and practical. Carey's description went into the report and stayed there. The call is logged. The line was confirmed dead. The ringing has a known mechanism. What Carey heard does not. The crash calls. On October 31, 1999, EgyptAir Flight 990 departed John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, bound for Cairo, Egypt. It was carrying 217 people. 30 minutes after takeoff, at approximately 1:50 in the morning, the aircraft entered a rapid and catastrophic descent over the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 60 miles south of Nantucket. There were no survivors. The investigation that followed was extensive, contentious, and ultimately unresolved in any unified sense. The United States National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crash resulted from deliberate action by the relief first officer, who was alone in the cockpit when the descent began. Egyptian aviation authorities and EgyptAir disputed that conclusion vigorously and continue to do so. The official Egyptian position is that the cause remains undetermined. The case has never been closed to anyone's full satisfaction. All of this is documented history. What is less commonly discussed is a specific detail preserved in the supplementary witness statement files from the early phase of the investigation, collected by NTSB staff at JFK Airport in the days immediately following the crash. 3 individuals filed statements describing phone calls they received from numbers associated with passengers on Flight 990. The calls came in during the hours between approximately 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. on the morning of November 1st, well after the aircraft had struck the water. 2 of the 3 individuals were airport employees. One was a taxi driver who had been waiting in the pickup lane outside the international terminal. The most detailed of the 3 statements came from a gate agent who said she received a call on her personal mobile phone from a number belonging to a colleague, another airport employee who had been traveling as a passenger on the flight. She said she recognized the number immediately because it was saved in her phone under her colleague's name. She answered the call. She described hearing static, and beneath the static, at intervals, a sound she interpreted as breathing, rhythmic, faint, and without any voice attached to it. The call lasted less than 30 seconds, then it ended. By the time she received that call, the phones belonging to the passengers of Flight 990 were resting on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Communication specialists brought in during the investigation pointed to a known failure mode in 1999-era cellular network infrastructure. At that time, carrier switching systems operated with less standardization and fewer safeguards than modern networks. A documented anomaly existed in which a call in transit through the switching system could be misassigned, tagged with the identifying number of an inactive or destroyed SIM rather than the number it was actually originating from. This was not deliberate spoofing. It was an accidental routing error rooted in the architecture of the network at that time. The explanation is plausible for 2 of the 3 statements, but it sits uneasily with the gate agent's account. Her phone had her colleague's number stored as a named contact. The incoming call appeared under that contact name on her screen. For that to happen, the number transmitted to her phone had to be correct, her colleague's actual number, accurately transmitted. A random misrouting producing an arbitrary number would not have matched an existing saved contact unless by extraordinary coincidence. Her carrier investigated after she reported the call. They returned a finding that no call had been delivered to her phone during the window she described. There was no record of an incoming call at that time from any number. The NTSB investigators noted all 3 statements in the supplementary file and did not pursue them further. The primary investigation was focused on the aircraft, the flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorder, and the question of what happened in that cockpit at 1:50 in the morning. The phone calls were a peripheral detail. They remain in the file, noted and unexamined, alongside one of aviation's most disputed crash investigations. The Empty Observatory. The National Solar Observatory in Sunspot, New Mexico, sits at an elevation of nearly 9,000 feet in the Sacramento Mountains. It is a research facility operated to study the sun's surface and atmosphere. On the morning of September 6, 2018, staff arrived to find federal agents already on site. They were told to leave. The closure was immediate and offered no explanation to employees. A Black Hawk helicopter was observed operating in the area on at least 1 occasion during the closure. The post office in the small adjacent community of Sunspot was also closed and sealed. The entire site remained shut for approximately 10 days. The FBI eventually provided a public explanation. A janitor employed at the facility had been using the observatory's internet infrastructure to access and distribute child sexual abuse material. The individual was identified, arrested, and subsequently prosecuted. The closure, according to federal authorities, was necessary to secure the site during the investigation. The explanation was accepted by most observers, though some noted that the scale of the response, a Black Hawk helicopter, the closure of a post office, a 10-day shutdown, seemed disproportionate to the stated cause. That disproportion is not our concern here. What concerns us is a specific incident documented during the closure period. A reporter named Debbie Weir, working for a local outlet covering the story from Alamogordo, had previously called the observatory's main listed phone number multiple times, seeking comment. The number went to an automated voicemail system. She left messages that were never returned. On the 3rd day of the facility's closure, with no staff on site and the building sealed, her phone rang. The incoming call displayed the observatory's main number. She answered. There was no voicemail system greeting, no automated prompt, no recorded message. She described the quality of the line as an open connection, the ambient acoustic texture of an interior space, the faint presence of a room, rather than the flat silence of a dead line or the click of a disconnected call. The call lasted a short time, and then ended without any voice or message being delivered. She noted the incident in her published coverage of the closure. The observatory had no authorized personnel on site at the time the call was placed. A plausible technical explanation exists. Phone systems that are abruptly vacated without proper administrative shutdown, without someone going through the process of deactivating call forwarding rules, disabling callback functions, and closing out logged call queues, can sometimes initiate outgoing calls autonomously. Older PBX systems, which manage internal and external calls for facilities like research stations and office buildings, sometimes carry a missed call callback function. If an incoming call is logged, but not answered in a way the system recognizes as complete, some older PBX architectures will attempt to return that call after a delay. The observatory's phone equipment was described by people familiar with the facility as outdated. This explanation is technically coherent, but it depends on one condition. The system has to have power and an active connection to execute a callback. Whether the observatory's internal phone system remained powered during the closure, or whether the building was fully shut down at the electrical level, is not established in any available record. Staff were evacuated quickly. Whether anyone went through a systematic shutdown procedure, or whether they simply left, is unknown. The call happened. The building was empty. The mechanism that could explain it may have been in place. Whether it actually was is a detail the record doesn't resolve. The Keddie Rings. In April 1981, 4 people were murdered in Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort in Plumas County, California. The victims were a mother, 2 of her sons, and a friend of the family. 2 younger girls who were present in the cabin that night were abducted and found deceased in a neighboring county several weeks later. No one has ever been convicted of the murders. The case remains officially open. It is one of the more extensively documented unsolved homicides in California history, though the documentation itself is incomplete in ways that investigators have noted over the decades. The Keddie Resort fell into disuse through the late 1980s and 1990s. By the mid-1990s, it was largely abandoned. Cabin 28 itself was demolished in 2004, but in the years before the demolition, a small number of people still lived in some of the resort's other structures, occupying them on informal arrangements. One of those residents, a woman who lived in a cabin approximately 200 yards from Cabin 28 through 1997 and 1998, gave a recorded interview to a true crime research group that has spent years documenting the case. That group's work has been cited by California law enforcement in requests related to the case file. In the interview, the woman described a recurring experience with the resort's old phone infrastructure. The resort had been built with a common internal phone line system that connected the various cabins to a central point, a remnant of its years as a functioning vacation property. By all accounts, that system had been non-operational for years. A telecommunications company confirmed in a letter submitted as part of a civil dispute related to the property that the common line infrastructure had not been active since at least 1993. The woman said that on multiple occasions during her time living there, the phone in her cabin would ring. When she answered, she heard what she described as a child's voice, not words she could identify, not language she could follow, but the tonal quality and register of a young child producing sound. The call would last a few seconds, and then the line would go silent. She filed a report with the Plumas County Sheriff's Office documenting these experiences. The report is in the record. Sheriff's deputies who investigated pointed to the presence of a communications relay station in the mountain terrain around Keddie. The region experiences significant radio frequency interference from both natural topographic sources and from the equipment at that relay station. The deputies noted that this kind of interference had previously caused irregular behavior in old copper wire infrastructure in the area. Phantom ringing, false signals, anomalous audio artifacts in handsets. The assessment attributed what the woman experienced to this environmental interference. It is a reasonable and established explanation for the ringing. The question is, what she heard when she answered. Pareidolia is the relevant phenomenon here. The human brain's documented tendency to extract familiar patterns from ambiguous or degraded input. We do it with visual noise, finding faces in random textures. We do it with audio, finding words in the sound of wind or the hum of machinery. A person in a place with a history she was aware of, answering a phone that shouldn't be ringing, listening to electrical noise in an old handset. That is a situation well suited to the production of meaningful patterns from meaningless input. That explanation is available, and it is grounded in documented cognitive science. But it is an explanation for how perception works, not a confirmation of what the signal actually contained. The line produced something. What it produced is categorized but not verified. The report exists. The experience is documented. The gap between the mechanism and the content remains open. The ocean signal. In 1985, a telecommunications technician employed by British Telecom was conducting routine monitoring work on a transatlantic cable segment from a station in Cornwall on the southwestern tip of England. His job involved watching for signal anomalies on active lines, degradation, interference, unusual traffic patterns. It was technical maintenance work, largely unremarkable. During one monitoring session, he detected a signal on a cable that was not active. Transatlantic telephone cables, when decommissioned, are typically depressurized and left on the ocean floor. The economics of retrieval make removal impractical. The cable in question had been taken out of service in 1978, 7 years before the technician encountered the signal. It was lying on the floor of the North Atlantic, disconnected from any active switching system at both ends. The signal was not background noise. The technician wrote in his report that it carried what he described as the spectral characteristics of voice band transmission. In technical terms, voice band refers to the frequency range, roughly 300 to 3,400 Hz, used for telephone voice transmission. A signal displaying those spectral characteristics is one that, when analyzed, looks like the kind of signal a human voice produces when transmitted over a telephone line. He recorded approximately 40 seconds of the signal and submitted it along with his written report. The report was filed, reviewed, and assigned a formal case number within British Telecom's internal system. This is confirmed by BT's internal records, which were partially released in response to a Freedom of Information request submitted by a researcher in 2009. A senior technical officer who reviewed the report noted in his written assessment that the spectral analysis of the recorded signal was consistent with human voice band frequencies. BT's formal conclusion was cross-coupling. This is a documented electromagnetic phenomenon in which a signal traveling through an active cable induces a sympathetic signal in a nearby inactive cable that runs in close physical proximity. The two cables, the active one and the decommissioned one, did share a significant portion of their transatlantic route, running parallel for hundreds of miles along the ocean floor. Cross-coupling between parallel cables is a known and studied phenomenon. The question is one of degree. Cross-coupling typically produces a degraded, fragmented echo of the inducing signal, heavily attenuated, often unrecognizable. The technician's language, and more significantly, the senior officer's language in his review, suggests the signal was coherent enough to be categorized and recognized as voice band. That sits toward the upper range of what cross-coupling normally produces, though it is not technically impossible. Whether the signal was intelligible as speech, whether it contained recoverable content, is something that cannot be determined now. The original recording was submitted with the report in 1985. Whether it still exists in a retrievable form within BT's archive system is not known. The researcher who obtained the partial FOI release in 2009 was not able to confirm the recording's current location. The written description is in the record. The audio itself may not be accessible. The sanatorium phone. Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky, operated as a tuberculosis treatment facility from 1910 until 1961, when the disease had been sufficiently controlled by antibiotics to make large-scale institutional care unnecessary. The building was repurposed briefly as a geriatric care facility and then abandoned in 1981. It has sat largely empty since, deteriorating through the 1980s and 1990s before being purchased by private owners in the early 2000s with the intent of restoration. We are not interested here in the building's well-known reputation in paranormal investigation circles. We are interested in a specific set of documented reports from a specific period. Between 2001 and 2006, security personnel employed to watch the building overnight filed multiple reports of phones ringing inside the structure. These reports were logged in the security company's standard incident documentation, and those logs were made available to journalists working on stories about the restoration project. The reports are not anonymous claims or undocumented anecdotes. They are dated, timed entries in a professional record. The building's phone infrastructure consisted of old wall-mounted units, still physically attached to junction boxes throughout the structure. Some had been in place since the building's operational years. Louisville Telecommunications records confirm that no service account was associated with the property during the period in question. There was no active line. There was no billing relationship. There was no network connection. In September 2004, a security guard named Paul Browning documented a specific incident in his log. He was making rounds when he heard a phone ringing from the direction of the 4th floor. He located the ringing unit, a wall-mounted phone at the end of a corridor, and answered it. He described hearing what he interpreted as a female voice speaking briefly, the words indistinct, before the connection ended. He noted in his log the time, his location in the building, the location of the phone, and the duration of the call. A second guard was present on the premises that night and heard the phone ring. That guard did not answer it and did not hear what Browning described hearing. Both accounts appear in the security log for that date. The building's owners, responding to the accumulating reports, brought in a telecommunications engineer in 2005 to examine the infrastructure. His findings were documented in a written report. He found that the building's copper wiring, though disconnected from the active telephone network, was capable of receiving induced electrical current from nearby active lines. The building sits in close proximity to a telephone switching station, a major junction point in Louisville's telephone network infrastructure. The electromagnetic fields generated by active lines at that station were sufficient to induce current in the building's disconnected copper wiring. The engineer's conclusion was that phantom ringing, bell mechanisms in the old phone units triggering in response to induced current, was the most technically credible explanation for the ringing reports. He also addressed the question of audio, noting that electrical interference in old handset components can produce sounds that the human brain sometimes organizes into recognizable patterns, including voice-like patterns. The report is the most thorough technical assessment applied to any incident in this documentary. It identifies a real mechanism. It points to a real electromagnetic relationship between the building and the nearby switching station. The explanation for the ringing is solid. What the report does not detail is the specific mechanism by which induced current, rather than an actual live signal, produces voice pattern frequencies through a handset speaker. Standard phantom current produces static or hum. The conditions under which it would generate something with the tonal and rhythmic qualities of a voice are not described. The engineer identifies the phenomenon by name, but does not trace the full technical path from induced current to the audio pattern Browning described. That may be because the path is assumed, or because the report was not intended to be exhaustive. It may also be because the path is more technically uncertain than the report's conclusion implies. The record does not say. The mine transmission. On August 5, 2010, a collapse at the San Jose copper and gold mine near Copiapó in northern Chile trapped 33 miners approximately 700 meters underground. The scale of the collapse and the depth at which the miners were trapped made rescue enormously difficult. The operation that followed lasted 69 days and required drilling a new shaft through hundreds of meters of rock. All 33 miners survived. The rescue was documented in extraordinary detail and watched by an international audience. In the first 17 days, before rescue teams drilled through to the miners' refuge chamber and established communication, the men underground were presumed by many to be dead. The collapse had been severe. The emergency communication systems built into the mine's infrastructure were presumed destroyed or inaccessible. Families waited at the surface without confirmation that anyone had survived. On the 11th day of the rescue operation, a technician monitoring communications equipment on the surface logged an anomaly. A signal appeared on a frequency that had been assigned to the mine's internal emergency communication system, the dedicated radio and telephone infrastructure installed throughout the mine for use in exactly this kind of situation. That system, given what the rescue teams understood about the extent of the collapse, should not have been transmitting. The signal lasted approximately 90 seconds. The technician described it in his equipment log as structured, not random noise or interference, but carrying the organizational characteristics of an intentional transmission. He could not decode it. He could not determine whether it originated from a human source or an automated one. He reported it to site supervisors, and the report was preserved. The equipment log entry was later referenced in a technical review of the rescue operation commissioned by the Chilean government. That review concluded that battery-backed emergency communication hardware installed in isolated sections of the mine may have remained partially operational despite the collapse, sealed off from the destroyed sections, continuing to function on internal power. The signal, in the review's assessment, was most likely an automated status broadcast from one of those isolated units, transmitting its operational condition without any human initiating it. A machine reporting that it was still on, in a place where nothing was supposed to be on. When the miners were rescued, they were asked about communication attempts in the early days. Their accounts on this point are inconsistent. Several miners said they had attempted to use emergency communication equipment in the first days underground, but found it non-functional. Others recalled differently. The accounts, collected separately and over time, do not form a clear picture of what equipment was attempted, when, or with what result. Whether the signal on day 11 was the automated broadcast the technical review describes, or whether it was a human attempt that reached a receiver but not an interpreter, or whether it was something the review's explanation doesn't fully account for, is not something the surviving record establishes with certainty. The exclusion zone. On March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake off the Pacific coast of Japan triggered a tsunami that struck the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, causing 3 reactor meltdowns and a release of radioactive material that necessitated the evacuation of tens of thousands of people from the surrounding region. A 20-kilometer exclusion zone was established around the facility. The towns within it, Futaba, Okuma, Nami, and others, were emptied in a matter of hours. Residents left with what they could carry. Normal departure procedures, including the cancellation of utilities and services, did not happen. Journalists and researchers granted access to the exclusion zone in the years following the evacuation, documented various aspects of the abandoned infrastructure. The stopped clocks, the calendars still showing March 2011, the meals left on tables. Among those observations, noted independently by at least 3 journalists between 2011 and 2013, was a recurring detail. Landline phones in abandoned homes and businesses were ringing. One journalist, writing for a Japanese news magazine, described entering an abandoned convenience store in Namie and hearing the phone behind the counter ring twice. She included it in her published account, describing it as unsettling but likely explained, which proved to be an accurate assessment. NTT, Japan's primary telecommunications provider, confirmed in a public statement in 2012 that a significant portion of the landline infrastructure within the exclusion zone remained technically active. Because the evacuations had been abrupt and unplanned, the normal administrative process of service cancellation had not occurred. Accounts were open, lines were live. The billing continued on accounts belonging to people who could not return to cancel them. Because the lines were active, they functioned exactly as they were designed to function. Family members calling former homes, automated systems dialing businesses whose accounts remained open, creditors attempting contact. All of it routed normally through NTT's network to phones sitting in empty buildings. The phones rang because someone was calling. The explanation is complete. This case is included not because the mechanism is unclear, it is entirely clear, but because of what the mechanism produced. A functioning system continuing to operate in a context that had completely ceased to exist. Calls arriving for people who could not receive them, in buildings no one could safely enter, producing in an empty town the ordinary sounds of a place where people still lived. The technology did not know the context had ended. It kept doing what it was built to do. The MH370 calls. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 departed Kuala Lumpur International Airport on March 8, 2014, bound for Beijing, carrying 239 people. Approximately 40 minutes after takeoff, communication with the aircraft ceased. The plane diverted from its filed flight path, flew for several more hours according to satellite data, and then disappeared. Despite one of the most extensive searches in aviation history, the aircraft has not been found. The fate of the 239 people on board remains officially undetermined. In the days immediately following the disappearance, several family members of passengers reported an experience that received wide coverage. When they called their relatives' mobile phone numbers, the calls did not immediately go to voicemail, as they would for a destroyed or fully powered-down device. The calls rang. Some family members described hearing multiple rings before being transferred. To them, this suggested the phones were still powered and connected to a network, that their relatives might still be reachable. Malaysian telecommunications authorities addressed this directly in a press conference and in subsequent written statements. The explanation they provided concerned the behavior of international roaming call routing systems. Under certain carrier configurations, when a call is placed to an international roaming number that cannot be reached, the switching system routes the call toward the voicemail server. In doing so, the system generates a ringtone on the caller's end before the transfer completes. This ringtone is produced by the routing architecture, not by the destination device. It sounds, to the caller, as though the phone on the other end is ringing. It does not indicate that the phone is powered on, within network range, or capable of receiving a call. Malaysian carriers confirmed this was standard behavior within their network infrastructure. Most telecommunications analysts who examined the question accepted the explanation. The ringing, in this context, is fully accounted for. What the official analysis did not address is a secondary detail described by at least two families. They reported that, in the moment after the ringtone concluded, in the transition between ringing and the voicemail greeting, they heard something. Not the voicemail prompt, not silence, something ambient, a quality of sound that suggested to them an open environment. One family described it as background noise, the sense of a space with air in it. Then the call transferred to voicemail. This specific experience was not examined in the telecommunications analyses, which focused on the ringing behavior as the primary concern of the families and the media at the time. Whether what those families heard was a genuine audio transmission, an artifact produced by the carrier's routing system during the handoff between ringtone and voicemail, or a perception shaped by the intensity of hoping to make contact, is not something any available documentation can determine. The ringing has an explanation. The routing architecture accounts for it completely. What came in the seconds after the ringing, for those two families, does not appear in any technical record. The dead man's line. The 10th case is not a single incident. It is a pattern that has been documented with enough consistency that mobile carriers in the United States have developed formal policies in response to it. The pattern is this: a person dies. In the period between their death and the formal closure of their mobile phone account, which can take days or weeks, particularly when a death is sudden and a family is managing many things at once, people who knew the deceased receive communications from that person's number. A call, a voicemail notification, the sound of a familiar voice from a phone that should, by rights, be silent. The most technically documented category involves voicemail delay. Mobile carriers do not store voicemail on individual devices. Voicemail is stored on carrier servers. Messages move through processing queues before being delivered to recipients. Under certain conditions, server load, system errors, routing anomalies, a message can sit in that queue for hours, days, or longer before being released. A voicemail recorded by a person a week before their death can be delivered to its intended recipient 4 days after the funeral, appearing as a new incoming notification from the deceased. This has occurred with enough frequency that AT&T and Verizon have both, at various points, issued guidance to estate attorneys and grief counselors about requesting voicemail holds on accounts of the deceased. The guidance exists because the deliveries happen, and because receiving an unexpected message from someone you have buried is a significant experience for the people who receive it. A case documented by a local news outlet in Jacksonville, Florida, in 2008 illustrates the mechanism clearly. A woman received a call notification from her husband's number 4 days after his death. She answered it and heard his voice, a reminder message he had recorded for her weeks earlier about a doctor's appointment, held in the carrier's processing queue and released by a system error. The carrier confirmed the delayed delivery was a documented fault in their infrastructure that they were in the process of correcting. The explanation is complete. The mechanism is understood. That case sits at one end of this pattern, fully explained, mechanism confirmed. But it sits alongside other documented cases where the explanation is less complete. cases where the contact was not a delayed voicemail but an active call, cases where the carrier found no record of any outgoing transmission from the number, cases where what the recipient describes does not map onto the queue delay mechanism or any other identified technical cause. What connects these cases to the others in this documentary is the gap between what the technical explanation covers and what the witnesses describe. In the Jacksonville case, the gap is closed. In others, it is not. The infrastructure that made the call possible is identified. The specific content and timing of the call is not fully accounted for by the mechanism offered. The broader pattern is what the 10th case is really about. Telecommunications infrastructure was not designed with the end of its users in mind. Accounts persist. Devices continue to register with towers. Servers hold messages in queues without knowing that the person who recorded them is no longer there to be reached. The system does not know when the human context that gave it meaning has ended. It continues to function according to its design, producing outputs that arrive after the conditions that created them have passed.